The author's note. The following is the introduction to a paper on the economic path forward for Trinidad and Tobago in the first instance and for the CARICOM states in general, a very ambitious project indeed. The paper is presented on behalf of the organization UMROBI, the Universal Movement for the Reconstruction of Black Identity, as part of the discussion on the redirection of economic development in Trinidad and Tobago. It is a discussion on the new economics versus the old economics. It is in fact the birth of a new economic order. This presentation is based on a paper entitled The Economic Path Forward. This presentation is the first of a two-part document that is intended to both initiate discussion on the one hand and to offer the new economics versus the old economics paradigm. The paper is in response to the rapidly changing global landscape, which is itself in response to several challenges spawned by the global technological revolution in manufacturing and the industrial changes in both developed industrialized countries, the old centers of development, and the newly industrializing and developing economies, mainly from the South. The new economics is in response to the need for a new strategy of economic survival and growth in a time of both dwindling petroleum prospects and increased vulnerabilities of the existing regional economies in an environment of new and galloping threats of natural disasters, as well as the impact of climate change and the environmental crisis. The paper seeks to offer a new path forward for Trinidad and Tobago especially, and as well to the CARICOM states in general. The Economic Path Forward Introduction. Any serious discussion on the economic path forward for Trinidad and Tobago must, of necessity, first be a discussion on the path forward for the entire West Indies. We must, of necessity, extend our focus and begin to think beyond the narrow boundaries and confines of the Anglophone Caribbean. We have long learned that the separate economies of the individual island territories are simply non-viable, each by itself. This lesson is one that should have been learned long ago. At least it has been patently obvious or apparent soon after the demise of the economies of the West Indian Islands at the end of the period of slavery, 1834, and the early plantation era. The separate island economies at that period depended exclusively on the production of agricultural products, sugar, cotton, coffee, cocoa, etc., for the European market, and were to face their first major challenge with the development of the Industrial Revolution in Europe, specifically Great Britain, on the one hand, and the end of slavery of 1834 to 1838 on the other. We should note that several plantation owners did in fact own plantations on several of the islands, and some even owned plantations in the American colonies. The most well-known was Alexander Hamilton's parents. During that period, the market was guaranteed. The question of optimum market size had become even more critical in the second half of the 19th century at the end of the slavery in the British Empire. In order to achieve optimum market viability today, we must assume an optimum territorial or physical size, specifically plantation size. In fact, one of the major challenges of West Indian plantation agriculture during the slavery period was the larger sizes of estates in Haiti initially. Then, after the successful revolution of 1793, 1804 in Cuba and Brazil. Today, this issue has continued to haunt West Indian success in agriculture, especially for the export market. In order to be able to meet the challenges of an ever-changing market, there must be coherent planning, negotiation, and political action. There must be economics coherence, even if we do not achieve political unity. We should remember that this need for a political construct of some form of economic unity was first articulated by Sir Arthur Lewis, the region's only economic Nobel Prize winner. That was in his publications in the late 1940s and the early 1950s. This call was also made by Eric Williams while he was with the Caribbean Commission between the years 1940 and 1955. Yet again, the very West Indian Federation of 1958-1962 of Norman Manley, Grantley Adams, Eric Williams, and T. Marichaud, among others, was a bold statement, no, a plea for just such an economic model of unity. In fact, the Caribbean single market and economy of Dimas, McIntyre, etc., was for the very same economic union. One must remember that the Caribbean community, CARICOM, is the continued recognition and the resonance of just such a call. We must note that CARICOM is the oldest surviving economic integration movement in the developed world. We may note that CARICOM is the oldest surviving economic integration movement in the developing world. We have therefore demonstrated recognition both in the literature and the political arena of the need for a wider economic reality. We therefore have demonstrated both the persistence and the pedigree, but we have not demonstrated that we have learned our lessons well. That is the central question with which we are now confronted. We have continued to mouth platitudes of economic unity and collaboration in planning, but to date, we have done or achieved precious little, and there remains little by way of success to make serious economic unity a concrete reality. We continue to pursue non-viable single market economic initiatives, whether it be tourism, agriculture, that is bananas, cocoa, coffee, citrus, etc., or petroleum, mining, or petrochemicals. Individual plans and policies abound, but with respect to applications, even the examples of failure at integrated planning are few. This remains possibly the core of our present economic vulnerability. We have continued to build our individual islands or territorial economies based on the whims and fancies of the countries of the North Atlantic. This is just as we had done during the period of enslavement and down through the ages of indentureship and of post-colonial slavery. Today, even after independence and an attempt at federation, we have continued with the same unsuccessful strategy. We remain subject to the vicissitudes of weather and climate of the North Atlantic while being indifferent to the climate change and environmental crisis within the Caribbean region itself. Above all, we remain ignorant of the inevitable march of global technology change in general and the Industrial Revolution transformation in particular, taking place in the developed, industrialized, and financial centers of the world. We have been indifferent to globalization tsunami that has been engulfing the region and the developing world. A brief comment at this juncture on education must be made. Our educational system to be driven by and in response to economic, political, and social forces that belong to the needs of the second industrial revolution, that is 1900 to 1960. This is where, unfortunately, our industrial thrust, in fact, where our industrial plant and machinery have remained, except possibly for the petroleum and petrochemical-driven economies, which of necessity have responded to a greater degree and only in respect of the second, that is 1900 to 1960, and the early third, 1960 to 1990 industrial waves. Any discussion on the path forward for the national economy must first identify what are to be the possible growth areas upon which the economy will depend. It must then identify the hurdles which must be overcome and the associated vulnerabilities of the new complex economy. 1.1 Central Issues and Challenges. The new economy must therefore identify and address as central the following. A. Inequality. The gross inequality of wealth within the society, that is Trinidad and Tobago, and by extension CARICOM states, as between the classes of citizens who own and control a significant share of the national economic resources and therefore its patrimony, and those other classes who survive payday to payday, often in debt and even poverty, in spite of the fact that they may be working every day. These constitute the working poor. This gross inequality constitutes the central contradiction within Trinidad and Tobago and within the entire West Indies without exception. Meaningful discussion must not only address the inequality between different economic classes, but the discussion must include the inequality between the socio-economic groups within the society, especially within the underclass who own very little. It is common, the author warns, for some within the society to describe any such call for meaningful discussion on poverty as no more than agitation and the fanning of the fires of racial hostility or even stern socialist type class hostility. The abundance of the data supports this call nevertheless. This inequality is the very cancer eating away at the economic and social stability of the body politic. The discussion must therefore include a more focused and honest analysis of the issue of source and nature of this inequality in the region that is CARICOM, as we seek to genuinely define the path forward as the basis of meaningful economic unity within the region. All this must be in the context of developing a better grasp of the human and other economic resources which are to be invaluable inputs included in the new equation of economic development. Quantifying economic resources. We must identify and attempt to quantify the physical resources upon which the new economic order will be based. This is critical. It certainly will not be Arthur Lewis's surplus of labor, but at the same time, it will include our human resources in all its forms. It will include our lands and, by extension, the agricultural potential of the natural resources. It will include our unique climate, as well as our marine resources and our environmental treasures, and hence our tourism potential. It will include our mineral resources, our forests, as the backbone for an industrial development. It will include the rich human capacity, its acquired wisdom and skills in the heavy industry in mining, petroleum exploration and refining, production of sugar, planting, reaping, and the processing of cocoa, coffee, bananas, citrus, fruit juices, and above all, molasses and rum. This rich heritage will be the starting point of exploration to develop an economic program. Finally, we have a highly literate and educated population upon which to boldly step out into a new and technologically sound economic path forward. One may even contemplate an industrial thrust based on our own human resources and on the resources existing outside of the region. A genuine mixed economy. C. Discussion on a new economic order must seek to solve the vestigial problems of the enslavement period as well as those of the post-emancipation colonial period up to our independence. It must as well take a bold step to resolve the problems that have festered and developed in the period since independence. This must be our opportunity to design a genuinely new era and a new path forward for all the citizens of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, and by extension, the people of the wider CARICOM region. This brings us to the context and economic and legal environment to house this new economic order. This can only be the framework of a genuinely mixed economy where economic equality is part of the new constitutional Bill of Rights of citizenship. It is clear that the economy of the future must be based on a mechanism that allows all the social forces within the society to flourish. That is, there must be a genuine case of a mixed economy. There must be a clearly defined, in law, state sector and a clearly defined private sector, both protected by the Constitution and the law. We have to discuss the two dominant partners in this mixed economy. First, the private sector. There must be a clearly defined domain within which the private sector is free to explore almost unfettered. The private sector must nevertheless respect the rights of individuals. Above all, the private sector in return must seek to develop always the national interest. This must be carried out by way of future planning and its contribution to the national economic life. This must be done not only by way of providing employment, payment of taxes, but by way of meaningful contribution to the rest of the social life of the society. The private sector must not only be free to pursue the full development of the private sector itself within the defined boundaries. We must stress here that the private sector must be free to seek its development and is free to produce all economic opportunities, but that these must coincide with and serve the national interests. It must not subvert or act contrary to the national interests or the public interests. The private sector will not and cannot provide the leadership during the period of transition. Self-interest will trump national interests. This has been made obvious by COVID-19 pandemic. The only other organized force to undertake this transition is the public sector. And therefore we must look at what is the nature of the public sector. Public sector. If the public sector is to provide leadership in this period of transition and transformation of the economic path forward, then several conditions must be met to make this possible. First, the state or the public sector must possess several enabling aspects. The public sector must possess the financing to be able to play its role, and secondly, the state sector must be free to play its part in the direct development of certain aspects of the national economy. This is necessary to give it access to vital information that will allow it to make strategic decisions at opportune moments. The state sector must therefore play a critical and central part in the very productive processes of the national economy. It cannot simply be consigned to providing national security or social services and finance these only on the collection of taxes. The state sector must have the right to enter and operate in certain critical aspects of the economic life or activity within the society in the broader interest of the entire nation. The state must be permitted by law to commandeer any aspect of the national economy in the interest of the country. The state must be permitted by law to instruct the private sector to produce any products in times of national emergency. Witness the recent experience in the US during the period of COVID-19. The private sector is not designed, equipped, nor motivated to give this leadership in times of meaningful and fundamental social engineering. Inequality and poverty do not simply happen. They are caused. They are the direct result of political and economic rights and opportunities which citizens have or should all have. They are the direct results of the absence of these conscious systems. We can see this as a manifestation of the nature of the free enterprise system that attaches political power to ownership of national resources. Concentration of economic ownership and power also produces inequality and extremes of poverty. The new economic order must therefore plan to deal with these extremes, which it must recognize as the core rights of citizens. The state is the only agency that can ensure and guarantee rights of citizens and ensure economic rights of all, and hence be the guardian controller of extremes. It is the guardian of the economic as well as social and political rights of citizens. It alone can contain and curb extremes, inequality of all rights, political and economic. It alone can guard against poverty. History has taught us that this lesson applies to even the most developed, industrialized, free enterprise market countries. The state must have exclusive right to enter and to operate certain sectors of the national economy and political sphere, example security, national emergency, and critical infrastructure systems. The recent experience of 2020 COVID pandemic has graphically demonstrated this latter aspect in both developed free enterprise countries, as well as in smaller developing countries. The global threat of climate change and the environmental crisis have further demonstrated the need for some of that restraint on the private sector, particularly in free enterprise market capitalist countries. A mixed economic model must be an economic model of shared risk and shared national economy. It must be an economic model of guaranteed equal opportunities and equal rights, both civic, political, and economic rights. The author wishes to emphatically state that it is only the state or the public sector that can guarantee these. This is a central issue which guarantees social and economic justice. It is important for us to define what is the public sector. It is the state sector or government sector, as some people call it. In Trinidad and Tobago and in most CARICOM countries, it consists of the following 5 elements: central government or ministries, local government, city councils, borough councils, etc., statutory authorities or the utilities providers, state enterprises or state companies, and 5th, commissions that could be either ad hoc or short-term or permanent or long-term. On the other hand, what is the private sector? This is the group of business entities set up by individuals to generate wealth for the owners. And these consist of sole traders or individually owned business entities, limited liability companies or business entities owned by several individuals collectively, or partnerships or business entities owned by multiple individuals all operating in the same service area. Final one is the joint venture, which represents all attempts, either temporary or short-term or long-term business alliances of the first earlier types expressed. There is another group that falls within the private sector, which some people would argue should be put in a third sector. This is debatable. And this is what is called the not-for-profit organizations. And these represent a cluster of either NGOs, CBOs, or faith-based organizations. We should note that it is the author's considerable submission that no iteration or conceived model of unbridled free enterprise or market-driven system can be expected to address, far less resolve, the fundamental contradictions of the Caribbean societies, the chief of which are runaway economic inequality and deep-rooted poverty. The author further submits that a model of genuinely mixed economy should, as a result, be the preferred model for the economic path forward, both for Trinidad and Tobago and for a new construct of a mega or multi-economic unit of Caribbean states, whether it be the existing full members of CARICOM or associate members are included. In conclusion, the author summarizes with a list of the following issues as central to the exercise of preparing a new economic path forward for Trinidad and Tobago, and I stress, by extension, for the new and just economic union for Caribbean states. The Caribbean of the future envisaged includes the following. 1. That the path forward which is contemplated as being viable can only be premised on a wider construct of Caribbean states as a necessary condition. I want to repeat that. The path forward which is contemplated as being viable, as opposed to all our previous attempts that were non-viable, can only be premised on a wider construct of Caribbean states as a necessary condition. In other words, Trinidad cannot see development by itself. Here, the only challenge is, which are the territories that will constitute this wider union? Will it be confined to the full members of the present CARICOM? Or will it involve associate members or members now considered as territories with observer status? The next question is, what will be the various economic clusters, a concept that the author develops in the next chapter, based on existing economic resources to be relied upon? Example, and the following are offered. Tourism plant and services. 2, agriculture for export based on mega farms and exotics. 3, agriculture for regional sustainability based on small farms and regional distribution. Note that I pointed out 2 different streams of agriculture, one for export and one for regional consumption. 4, petroleum and petrochemicals, including gas. 5, mining. 6, forests and timber products and furniture production and internal partitioning in buildings. Next, the marine economic zone, including fishing and extraction. Next, manufacturing based on new technological development, including robotics and information technology. Next, services, including education. It is necessary to state at this juncture that the aim here is building a new economic order for Trinidad and Tobago, and I repeat again, by extension for the Caribbean community. That the focus is one of consolidation and cooperation rather than competition in all aspects, including planning, marketing, technology, information, and financing. The final note would be on the question of education. This issue of education is another fundamental one. Our approach here will not be in debating what is the purpose of education or any such esoteric issue, or to seek to differentiate between education versus training. The present author will not engage in that discussion. This has been dealt with previously and elsewhere by several more competent scholars. Suffice it to say that the question of education is fundamental. We must ask ourselves the question, education for what purpose? We need to revisit our entire educational framework. We need to revisit the underlying reason for education at all levels. We must begin at kindergarten, primary, and secondary level, as well as undergraduate, postgraduate levels in the university context. Nevertheless, there must be a thread of continuity throughout the entire education process. Education must be more focused and relevant, and we must be mindful of the present and future developmental needs of the society. Education must be synchronized with the present stage of the Industrial Revolution, but as well with the future technological developments. It must anticipate the future place of work into which the young graduates will soon be entering. Education must be about preparing for citizenship in the future, but above all, it must resonate with relevance. In summary, the central issues are as follows. 1. The new economic order must be Caribbean in focus, as opposed to insular, if it intends to be viable. The new economic order must be based on clusters of collaboration and cooperation within the wider construct of the Caribbean. The new economic order must be based on economic rights as well as democratic rights of all classes and all citizens. And finally, technology and industrialization must be central in the developmental matrix for Trinidad and Tobago, and by extension for the Caribbean region. Thank you very much.